She wouldn't stop shouting, "Show me the will," at the funeral, but she had no idea the real proof wasn't in a paper, it was spread across 2,000 acres of land. What happened next left everyone there completely speechless. Her voice cut through the final prayer like a crack of thunder. "Where is the will?" People turned in confusion. Some thought grief had made her lose control. Others stared at me, waiting for a reaction. I stayed seated in the front row, eyes fixed on my grandfather's casket, hands folded, breathing steady. Karen stood near the aisle in sharp black clothes, finger pointed straight at me. She wasn't whispering. She wanted everyone to hear. "If there's no will, there's no proof," she declared loudly. "And without proof, that land doesn't belong to you." A wave of murmurs rippled through the mourners. Land. She had said it out loud. The one thing my grandfather never spoke about publicly was now floating in the air of a church filled with witnesses. I could feel dozens of eyes pressing into me, but I did not move. Because Karen had just made a mistake she couldn't undo. She believed ownership lived inside a document. She didn't understand that ownership could live in soil. Outside those church walls, beyond the paved streets and tidy fences, stretched 2,000 acres of open land. Fields that had known my family's footsteps for decades. Boundaries marked long before Karen ever arrived in this town. She thought she was exposing me. What she was really doing was forcing me to reveal something my grandfather had carefully protected for years. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket and touched the plain envelope resting there. No stamps. No official seals. Just paper inside. Karen noticed. "That better be the will," she snapped. I slowly stood for the first time. A hush fell over the room. I pulled the envelope out and held it calmly at my side. "This," I said quietly. "This isn't the will." Confused whispers filled the air. Karen smirked. "Then you have nothing." I looked at her for the first time. "You're wrong." I nodded toward the church doors. "Because the real proof isn't in this envelope. It's out there." Her smile faded. "And tomorrow," I added softly, "I'll show you exactly what belongs to me." Morning arrived wrapped in a thin layer of fog that hovered low across the fields like a curtain waiting to rise. I parked my truck at the end of the dirt road my grandfather used every Sunday, the same path he drove without ever explaining why. Within minutes, cars began pulling in behind me. Curiosity moves faster than respect. Neighbors stepped out quietly, whispering to each other. Some still wore the same black coats from the funeral. Phones were already in hands, ready to record whatever they thought was about to happen. Karen's SUV arrived with confidence. She stepped out wearing dark sunglasses, arms crossed, posture stiff with expectation. Two HOA members stood beside her like silent support. They believed today would prove I had nothing. They were wrong. Because parked 50 yards into the field was a white county survey truck. A man in a reflective vest stood beside a tripod instrument pressed into the ground. Another worker walked slowly through the grass, scanning for markers invisible to everyone else. Karen frowned. "What is this supposed to be?" I didn't answer. I walked toward the surveyors. The older one nodded politely. "You must be the grandson." "Yes." He tapped the metal legs of the tripod. "We pulled original county records from 1968. These boundary markers haven't moved in over 50 years. Karen scoffed behind us. "Markers? There's nothing here but weeds." The surveyor pointed his boot toward a small metal pin buried in the soil. "Property corner." Her smile tightened. The second worker called from the distance, "Found the eastern boundary stake." A murmur spread through the crowd. Karen stepped closer, irritation turning into unease. "That doesn't prove anything. Anyone can stick metal into dirt." The surveyor straightened. "These are registered county boundary markers. They match the deed map perfectly." That word made the air heavier. Deed. I opened the envelope from yesterday and unfolded the aging map inside. The paper was worn, the ink slightly faded, but the lines were clear and official. I handed it to the surveyor. He studied it, then nodded. Exact match. Karen moved quickly. Let me see that. He handed her the map. Her eyes scanned it fast. Then slower. Then very slowly. Because for the first time, she wasn't looking at empty land. She was looking at boundaries. And those boundaries were far larger than she ever imagined. Her voice dropped. This can't be right. I spoke calmly. It is. The fog began lifting, revealing how far the land stretched in every direction. And Karen realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was 2,000 acres. By midday, the fog had burned away, leaving the field exposed under a hard, honest sun. Nothing was hidden anymore. Not the land. Not the truth. Not the expressions on the faces gathered along the dirt road. Karen had removed her sunglasses. That small detail told me more than anything she could say. The surveyors continued walking the perimeter with steady precision. One placed bright flags into the soil at measured intervals. The other called out numbers that matched the map in my hands exactly. Neighbors whispered behind us. How big did he say it was? 2,000 acres. That's impossible. But it wasn't. Karen stepped closer to the surveyor, her voice no longer loud but tight with strain. There has to be a mistake. The HOA had plans for this land. We discussed future development here. The surveyor didn't even look up. Then those plans were based on incorrect information, ma'am. Incorrect information. Those words landed heavily in the quiet air. Karen turned to me. Why didn't you say anything before? I folded the map slowly. Because nobody asked politely. A few neighbors hid faint smiles. She ignored them. If this is true, why didn't your grandfather ever build anything here? Why leave it empty? I looked across the open field, remembering long drives with him, how he would park in the middle of nowhere and sit in silence, watching the wind move through the grass. He didn't need to prove ownership by building on it, I said. He just liked knowing it was his. That answer frustrated her more than any argument. One of the HOA members stepped forward cautiously. We should verify this with the county office. The surveyor finally looked up. We already did. That's why we're here. Silence fell again. Karen's confidence was draining visibly now, like water leaking from a cracked glass. Then the second surveyor returned holding something small and rusted in his hand. Found the original western marker, he said. Stamped with the county seal. He wiped the dirt away and showed it to the group. The date stamped into the metal was older than most houses in the neighborhood. Proof that this boundary existed long before Karen, long before the HOA, long before the expansion plans they believed in. Karen stared at it without speaking. And for the first time since the funeral, she had nothing to say. But this wasn't the moment that truly shook her. That moment came when the surveyor asked me a simple question. Would you like us to mark the full perimeter today? I nodded. And Karen realized this wasn't just confirmation. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Bright flags began appearing across the field like silent witnesses rising from the grass. One after another, the surveyors walked outward, placing each marker exactly where the old map instructed. From the road, the pattern slowly formed a shape so large it was difficult to understand without stepping back. 2,000 acres was no longer a number. It was becoming visible. Karen stood motionless beside her SUV, arms no longer crossed, watching the line of flags stretch farther and farther into the distance. Each new marker seemed to pull something away from her: confidence, control, certainty. This is ridiculous, she muttered, but there was no force left in her voice. The neighbors had stopped whispering. Now they simply watched in silence, absorbing the reality unfolding in front of them. Phones were still recording, but no one commented loudly anymore. The mood had shifted from curiosity to realization. One of the HOA members approached me slowly. "We honestly didn't know," he said. "Our development plans were based on newer maps. This land was marked as unregistered." I nodded. "Because no one checked the original records." He glanced toward Karen, then back at me. "This is going to cause problems." I looked across the field. "For who?" He didn't answer. An hour passed. People leaned against car doors or sat on hoods, but no one left. They wanted to see how far this would go. Karen finally walked over to me. "You planned this," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "You did. Yesterday." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "If you hadn't shouted at the funeral, none of this would be happening today." That truth seemed to land harder than anything else. Just then, the surveyor returned with a clipboard and handed me a printed sheet. "Preliminary confirmation," he said. "Matches county registry exactly. Full report will be filed tomorrow." Karen's eyes dropped to the paper. Tomorrow. That word echoed in her mind. Because tomorrow meant this would no longer be a field argument. It would become an official record. Legal. Documented. Permanent. She looked back at the flags barely visible now at the far edge of the field. "This can't be over," she whispered. I folded the paper calmly. "Oh, it's not," I said. "Because proving the land was mine was only the first step. What came next would affect far more than just her pride." By late afternoon, the surveyors packed their equipment, but the story refused to pack away with them. Neighbors drove off carrying videos, photos, and a version of events that would travel through messages and conversations long before sunset. Karen remained by her SUV longer than anyone else, staring at the flags as if memorizing a mistake she could no longer undo. I left the field and drove straight to the county records office. Inside, the building smelled like paper and quiet history. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A clerk with reading glasses looked up as I approached with the envelope and the preliminary sheet. "I need certified copies of the original deed and boundary registry for this parcel," I said. She typed slowly, paused, then looked up with raised eyebrows. "This is extensive." "I know." She disappeared into the back and returned with a thick folder coated in dust. She set it down gently, almost respectfully. "These records go back decades. Continuous ownership. No transfers. No disputes. That's rare." I opened the folder. Maps. Stamps. Signatures. Dates older than most homes nearby. My grandfather's name. His father's name. A quiet chain of ownership stretching through time without interruption. Proof that never needed to shout. "Can I get copies of all of this?" I asked. She nodded. "You might want them." As the copier ran, my phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from neighbors. Missed calls from unknown numbers. One voicemail from an HOA board member asking if we could talk calmly. I didn't respond. Because this was no longer about the land. It was about what they had tried to plan on it. I had seen the flyers months ago. HOA proposals for future expansion. Road extensions. Housing plots. All drawn confidently across space they believed belonged to no one. But it belonged to someone. And no one had asked. When I stepped outside, Karen was leaning against her SUV across the street. She had followed me. She walked over slowly, confidence replaced by calculation. "We need to talk," she said. I held up the folder of copies. "I agree." Her eyes dropped to the papers. "This doesn't have to get messy," she added. I looked at her carefully. "It already is. Because tomorrow, when the survey report became official, something much bigger than embarrassment was going to surface. And Karen was starting to realize she hadn't just made a scene at a funeral. She had triggered a problem the HOA could not quietly fix. The official survey report was filed with the county the next morning. Stamped. Logged. Permanent. By noon, the HOA had called an emergency board meeting. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The moment that report became public record, the situation stopped being my problem and started being theirs. My phone rang constantly. Unknown numbers. Repeated calls. Voicemails stacking up. One message read, "We genuinely didn't know. Please call us." I ignored them all. Instead, I returned to the field. The flags still moved gently in the wind, marking lines that had existed long before anyone thought to question them. The land looked the same, but it felt different now. Seen. Acknowledged. About an hour later, a black sedan pulled up behind my truck. Two men stepped out wearing suits, not HOA badges. Lawyers. They approached politely. "Are you the registered owner of this parcel?" one asked. "Yes." He nodded. "We represent the Homeowners Association." I gestured toward the field. "I assumed you might." He opened a leather folder. "We'd like to resolve this situation amicably." "Which situation?" I asked. He hesitated. "The planned development proposal for this land." There it was. Spoken plainly. I crossed my arms. "Go on." He cleared his throat. "The HOA approved preliminary plans 6 months ago to extend the neighborhood into this area. Roads, utilities, housing plots. Contracts were drafted. Deposits were made to contractors." I watched his expression. "And no one checked who owned it?" Silence. The second lawyer spoke quietly. "The land was marked unregistered on updated maps. No one thought to check historical records." "That sounds expensive," I said. They exchanged a look. "It is." Wind moved through the grass between us. "We're hoping," the first lawyer continued, "that you might consider selling a portion of the land to avoid complications." Karen's voice from the funeral echoed in my memory. "If there's no will, there's no proof." Now they wanted to buy what they assumed was free. "I'm not selling," I said calmly. Both men stiffened. "Then this could become a serious issue," one admitted. I nodded slowly. "I think it already is. Because this had stopped being about money. This was about responsibility. And someone in the HOA had signed off on plans for land that was never theirs." By evening, the entire neighborhood knew. People weren't whispering anymore. They were choosing sides. Some blamed the HOA for carelessness. Others blamed Karen for creating the scene that exposed everything. A few quietly admitted they had attended meetings where expansion plans were shown on printed layouts, with neat roads and house plots drawn confidently across land they now realized was never available. Blank space on a map. That's all it had been to them. To my grandfather, it had been something else entirely. A legacy. The next morning, a courier delivered an official envelope to my door. Not an email. Not a phone call. Paper. Inside was a formal request from the HOA's legal team asking for an urgent mediation meeting to clarify misunderstandings and seek a cooperative resolution. I agreed to attend. Not for them. For the record. The HOA office was smaller than I expected. Framed photos of neighborhood events covered the walls. A long table filled most of the conference room. Karen was already seated when I entered. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. 2 lawyers sat beside her. 3 board members across the table. A small recording device sat in the center, capturing every word. This wasn't a neighborhood discussion anymore. This was damage control. One of the lawyers began carefully. We acknowledge that the land in question is legally and historically yours. I nodded. He continued, unfortunately, development planning has already progressed significantly based on incorrect data. I placed the copied deed folder on the table. You mean based on assumptions? No one argued. Karen finally spoke, her voice low. This got out of hand. I looked at her. You started it? She didn't deny it. The lawyer slid a document toward me. We are prepared to offer a financial settlement in exchange for partial access to the land and permission to continue the project. I didn't touch the paper. This isn't about money, I said. Confusion spread across their faces. Then what do you want? A board member asked. I leaned back slightly. I want to know who approved development plans on land you never owned. Silence filled the room. Because they all knew. And they all knew the answer was sitting right there. Karen's eyes dropped to the table. The silence in the room stretched longer than anyone expected. No one wanted to be the first to speak. The small recorder on the table captured every breath, every chair shift, every nervous glance between board members. Karen kept her eyes fixed on the polished wood surface, as if looking up would make everything worse. Finally, one of the older board members cleared his throat. The expansion proposal was introduced by the planning committee, he said carefully. Karen chaired that committee. No one reacted with surprise. Karen's fingers tightened together. The land was marked unregistered on updated county maps, she said quickly. I followed the information we had. I responded calmly. But you never checked the original records. She didn't answer. Because she hadn't. The lawyer leaned forward slightly. The issue now is not only incorrect planning. Contractors were paid deposits. Draft layouts were shared with residents. Expectations were created about future property values. Promises based on land that was never theirs. I opened the folder and slid a copy of the original deed across the table. This document has existed for over 50 years, I said. Anyone could have requested it. The room felt heavier. Karen finally looked up at me. You could have told us. I held her gaze. You could have asked without shouting at a funeral. That landed harder than anything else said in the room. Another board member spoke quietly. If this becomes a legal dispute, the HOA could face serious financial consequences. I nodded. Yes. And if homeowners learn their fees funded planning on land we don't own. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The lawyer folded his hands. We would like to avoid public litigation. I understood what he really meant. They wanted this handled quietly. But that option disappeared the moment Karen demanded to see a will in front of a church full of witnesses. I stood up slowly. I'm not suing, I said. Relief flickered across several faces. But, I continued, this needs to be corrected publicly. Transparently. Karen swallowed hard. What does that mean? She asked. It means the residents see every document. Every plan. Every mistake. Because this had stopped being about me. Now it was about everyone who trusted the HOA to do its job. 3 days later, every homeowner in the neighborhood found a printed notice in their mailbox. Not an email. Not a quiet update online. Paper. Official. Impossible to ignore. The letter explained everything in plain detail. The incorrect maps. The unchecked assumptions. The expansion proposal drawn across privately owned land. The survey results. The original deed records. The financial deposits already paid to contractors. And the name of the person who chaired the planning committee that approved it all. Karen. By evening, the neighborhood felt louder than it ever had. People stood in driveways holding the letter, talking in small groups. Phones rang constantly. Doors knocked. Questions spread faster than answers. I didn't have to say anything. The documents spoke for me. That night, the HOA held an emergency public meeting at the community hall. Every seat was filled. No one wanted to miss what would happen next. Karen sat at the front table, but not in the center chair anymore. A board member read a prepared statement aloud. Apologies were issued. Responsibility was acknowledged. New procedures for verifying land ownership were promised. Then came the part nobody expected. Effective immediately, the board member said, Karen has stepped down as head of the planning committee pending further review. A murmur moved through the crowd. Karen stared straight ahead, face pale, hands still in her lap. No arguments. No speeches. No defense. Because for the first time, she had nothing left to stand on. After the meeting, people approached me quietly. Some apologized. Some thanked me. Some simply nodded with a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. The next morning, I drove back to the field alone.
The survey flag still fluttered gently in the wind. The land looked the same as it always had, quite patient and birthed by human mistake. I stood in the middle of it and remembered my grandfather's words. Let them talk. Karen had talked, and in doing so, she forced the truth into the open. She thought she was embarrassing me at the funeral. What she really did was expose 2000 acres of history that had never needed to prove itself to anyone until now.